Okay.
All right, and we are here. I am with Dr. Michael Beam, who I had as a professor in my doctoral program, learned a lot from, so I wanted to share his knowledge with all of you as well. Before we get into some of those topics, Dr. Beam, could you just give us a little bit of a background on yourself, your expertise, and your experiences?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. Well, let me think. When I was young, I actually went into the IT field, and from pretty early on, I was working with computers, and I spent about a dozen years working in IT, both at small technology companies, internet service providers, and large enterprise networks. And after doing that for a while, I was interested in how technology was changing people's lives. And this is at a time when the internet and broadband were first really becoming widespread. I mean, when I started working in IT, people were just starting to use dial-up regularly to get on the internet. And by the time I left IT, people were starting to get internet bundled with their cable TV subscriptions, though it wasn't certainly as widespread as it is now. And there wasn't yet widespread high-speed wireless internet like we have with our phones and tablets today. But you could see all that coming down the pike, and it was already getting to the point where the internet was completely reshaping the media landscape, how people got information, how people communicated with each other, the distances that relationships could survive had really changed. And that really interested me. So I went back to school and wanted to use my sort of technical understanding, but combine it with more social science to understand sort of policies and changes in behaviors and how we can shape technology in ways that might impact human behaviors, but also how those human behaviors then shape the technologies that we use. So I went to graduate school in the mid 2000s and studied communication. And at the time, trying to focus my understanding of technology and human behavior, my one of my mentors at the time challenged me and said, how is using the internet or a web browser or going on Netflix, how is that any different than just using your TV or your radio? How does the internet actually fundamentally change what we know about our interaction with media? And that was a really good question, because a lot of the theories and the way in which we come to understand the relationship between media and news and people and health and all the various things, they were very much still in our social science field, really using theories that were related to TV and radio use and newspaper use, books, telephones. And there weren't many theories yet that really got into how is this internet thing fundamentally different, not just a big phone or not just a big TV. And as I thought about it and thought about my own experience working in the internet industries, some of my peers who had gone to Silicon Valley, and the emerging market where you had companies like Google already clearly dominant in the search space. At that time, Facebook wasn't quite as dominant as it is today, nor Amazon, but they were also there and on the rise. And I thought carefully about what is their business model? How do they make their money? How do they get companies, how do they give away their product for free and able to grow in the way that they are? And if you look at those companies, those tech companies today, they are the largest companies in the world by market capitalization. They're bigger than the biggest banks. They're bigger than the oil companies. They're really, truly global powerhouses, yet they give away their products for free largely. And their business model is built on harvesting the data from the people who use their products, then selling that to advertisers, which interestingly is a similar business model to commercial media, TV and radio and newspapers. Except the difference from the internet compared to mass media is that the internet can get micro level data from the individual and then give the individual a different media experience than the next. Whereas on broadcast TV or a newspaper, you are delivering a product that's going out to an entire audience, or maybe you're somehow breaking your product into 2 or 3 different versions based on different demographic or groups, but certainly not to the level of individual tailoring that we see with the internet. So going back to when I was in graduate school, I sort of made that realization that this individual level tailoring of information is what's new about the internet. And there wasn't a ton of research on that yet at the time. So when I started thinking about what I wanted to do my research on, it was quite that. It was how does tailored, individualized information impact its audience using a media effects framework, or sort of from a different framework from the individual, like how does an individual react to being individually targeted? And so that's sort of what set me on my research path. I also, because of my background in technology, I was teaching skills in communication technology mostly. I was an assistant professor at Washington State University. I started teaching the Adobe Creative Suite there. Also sort of how telecommunications networks work. And then I came here to Kent State and sort of continued similar work. And here at Kent State, my job, my tenure home, my home school is the School of Communication Studies. But we also have a school called Emerging Media and Technology that's an interdisciplinary school that engages computer science, computer information systems from our College of Business, our design schools, geography, educational technology, as well as our traditional communication and media disciplines that within our college. And we try to teach technology from a sort of more broad perspective than just being a computer engineer, being a network engineer, being a computer program, but a little bit more informed by all of this interdisciplinary work that's being done around technology. So just recently I moved into that interdisciplinary school.
Yeah, so this idea that, essentially we are the product, right, on social media because it's free, right? I mean, essentially we are the product. How does that change the experience? And maybe the follow-up to that, or maybe even within that, how would it change the experience if we had to pay for it?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. And if you rewind back, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, I don't think it was necessarily a foregone conclusion that all of our major internet uses were going to be free. There was a question for a time around what is the business model that's going to work on the internet. And back in the late 90s, we had a dot-com bubble, in part because of this crisis of how do you monetize the internet? How do you make a viable product? Because they were making products that lots of people used. So the question was, I think there were 2 questions there. So it was, how did we get here? And how does that, what was the first part of the question?
So essentially, how does it change our experience when we are the product?
Does it change our experience? Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it could go a lot of ways, but I think the way it's gone is the traditional way in a sort of business environment where a lot of these tech companies have gone public. And in our market, we have a incentive and a fiduciary obligation that companies are required to continue to grow or to make money. And their pact they have with the shareholders, the people who invest in their company, are if you put your money in our shares, we're going to make that value go up, right? And so the way in which their business model runs, which is the more you're engaged on their platform, the more advertisements you'll see and the more money they'll make, that shapes how we use our products, because now the product becomes engineered to keep us on their system, to keep us engaged. And so over the time, we've found out that certain things, like highly emotional experiences, sort of keep us there. It keeps us wanting more. So think about social media. Often the things that go viral aren't necessarily the most informative, but they're the things that are really visual and give you a high impact. And you look at them and you feel something. You could feel really good. You could feel really bad. You could feel angry. But those are the types of messages that really keep people scrolling. And that's for the social media environment. I think for search, we all use search all the time. We see certain very recognizable sources being the ones that float to the top. So when you search for something, it's in the search engines. It's in their interest to give you the very large company that in the search result, because you're going to feel that that's a credible source. So I think if there were different incentives in place, like if we paid for it, as you said, then the incentive becomes a little different for the company. The incentive is less about keeping you on the product, but it's keeping you satisfied with the product. And right now, I think there are a lot of technology experiences, especially like our dialogue right now about social media, that people aren't necessarily using social media and feeling good about it, but they're using it because it's somewhat addictive and it keeps us connected to each other. But I think if we paid for the product, there would be a different set of incentives for those companies to give us an experience that we as customers demanded, not the advertisers. And there were several companies back in the early 2000s to mid 2000s that tried to do that. Before Facebook was entrenched as the leader, before Twitter even existed, there were companies out there that said, hey, we don't like their business model, that they're using data to sell you to advertisers. Why don't you buy into our social network platform and pay us a monthly fee, $5 a month, or I don't know, you get some discount if you pay for a year in advance, and we'll keep your data safe. There won't be ads, much like we use Netflix, right? I mean, when we use Netflix, you're not seeing ads. You're paying a monthly fee, and then they have a different incentive of what kind of product to give you.
The subscription model.
Exactly, the subscription model. So, but those were not successful. I mean, for whatever reason, people didn't buy into that, and that's the same with search. We didn't buy into a paid product. The same is true with email companies and platforms. There are still niche companies that will allow you to do those things. You can go to certain companies and pay for an email server. But those companies, compared to like Gmail, they're very small.
Do you think there is a place perhaps today for a new social network, or maybe one of these ones we know and have come to love that we're already so addicted to? Like, for instance, I could see quite a few people who are addicted to Instagram. If that popped up one day and said, okay, now it's $7.99, what's the percentage of people that would probably a lot that would probably do that, right?
Probably, but just the enormous amount of money that a company like Facebook, who owns Instagram, makes, I don't think they'd be able to hit even close to the same margins that they make with their business model. And you have to understand, with Instagram, who are owned by Facebook, that part of their money-making proposition is they not only have the data from you using Facebook and maybe talking to your grandparents because it's mostly old people on Facebook, or on Instagram to maybe connect with your friends, but also WhatsApp.
Right.
So they have a whole ecosystem of products, and they combine all that data. And if they broke those out, there wouldn't be as much value to them as a company to hold all these different products.
Do you think these big tech companies are starting to care a little bit more about the ethical standards that they hold themselves to? I mean, we've seen a lot more in the news kind of recently about it, but I mean,
Right.
are they just kind of doing their due diligence? Are they really doing their due diligence, or are they just kind of saving face in a way?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think these, I think it's a complex question. A lot of these companies are really large at this point, and I've worked with people on Facebook's content moderation team. These are incredibly smart people who are very well intentioned, and their whole job is to make a more ethical, more safe platform. And I think those people truly believe in the work, and they are not just giving lip service to it. And they could be doing other things with their lives, but they think that, hey, I can make the most impact by moving this platform in a way that is protecting the individuals who use the platform and protecting democracy or public health or whatever the area of expertise these people have on these teams. And they do have broad areas of expertise in their team members. But it's part of a large institution. And there's also the business arm of the company who is thinking, hey, if we implement these rules that you're recommending, that could really cut into our engagement. I think there's a push and pull in those companies. I think, as you say, I do think this public outcry, the fact that the technology companies are getting called to Congress, and in 2016, the Russian bots that went on social media got a lot of media coverage, for better or for worse. And that was a black eye for the social media companies. And I think that if they start getting a bad reputation in the public sphere, people aren't going to want to use them. So in a way, public dissatisfaction with the way in which they've mishandled our data certainly provides more incentive for them to take data privacy more seriously. So I think there's multiple things going on there. But my view is that they have not been quick enough or fast enough to make the changes that are needed to be more secure, to be more transparent with individuals and regulators and researchers about how they're handling data. We could talk about ways in which to create systems that would force them to be transparent, but there's problems with them all. They're all super complicated, right? So right now we have a pretty laissez-faire system where these companies are able to make the rules themselves. And, there is, just as we said, some incentive for them to create a good set of rules, because the public gets upset when their rules are exploited if they're not well done, if they're not consistently enforcing their policies. But I certainly sympathize with the view that, hey, we don't want a private company that has as much reach as these companies have to be the arbiters of policies that affect decision-making in society. They have too much power. And, we have laws. There are different ways you can think about laws and regulations, antitrust laws or information regulation laws, though the First Amendment in our country is pretty strong and would make it pretty hard for the government to create any sort of content rules. But actually, the other side of it is, what's that?
I have a question there. That's interesting. First Amendment. So how is it different online, or I guess is it different online versus face-to-face encounters?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple things to think about there. One is our First Amendment protects us as individual citizens to be able to go out in the public square face to face and say really abhorrent things. I mean, in social science and political communication research, one of the ways in which we measure this is often, giving participants a scenario where the Ku Klux Klan comes to their community, and how in favor of blocking that would you be? But they have a right to be there. And when we're talking about social media, though, that is not a public space. That's not the public square. So a company like Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat or whoever, they are allowed to create their own rules, right? I mean, just because you have First Amendment speech doesn't mean that you're allowed to come into my house and say horrible things, and I have no way to remedy that, right? I mean, this is my private property, and I can say, you can't say these things, get off my property. Well, the same is true with internet spaces, that the social media space is a privately owned space. So a company like Facebook or Twitter, they get to make the rules of their space, and they get to say, you can't say that here. And so, as much as people like to say, I get to say whatever I want, it's free speech, you're violating my First Amendment rights, that's actually incorrect. Right. But on the other hand, the First Amendment does make it very hard for the government to create any rules for those private spaces, to tell Facebook, hey, you have to allow this kind of speech or deny this kind of speech, because they have the right to be able to make their own rules. In Europe or other places in the world, but largely the European Union, they have a different balance of their sort of constitutional principles. And in those spaces, while they still have some free speech rights, the rights of equality and justice, which we also have in our system, they weigh a little differently in the balance between them. So a lot of people look to the EU for being a regulatory body that might better have teeth in regulating these social media companies or search companies in content moderation rules. And a question would be, if they did that, would it be easier for a company like this to just comply with the European rules on their product globally, or would they create a separate product for Europe compared to the rest of the world, or whoever it is that creates these rules? But then you run the problem of, do you want to give the government the power to make the rules, right? I mean, we live in a democracy, so in theory, the government is enacting the people's will. But way too often we see overreach and corruption happening at the government level. So there's, not only problems of having the private companies make the decisions of moderation, but there's also problems with having the government make the moderation decisions. So it's complicated.
Especially, as you mentioned at the top, how much power these private companies have. I mean, it's essentially another branch of government in a way in 2020. You can kind of deem it as that. But I think you're right. I think people see it as, well, it's free. Everybody's here and nobody pays anything, so I should be able to say what I want, right?
Correct. And that's an incorrect perception
right.
of at least the regulatory environment. Yeah.
Right. But going back to the issue with kind of algorithms and taking a step in that direction again, specifically looking at politics. And you mentioned the 2016 election and again, the 2020 election. One thing I really enjoyed from seeing from Twitter was they just said, no, we're not gonna do it. So I spent most of my time there just because I knew it was going to be a place where I could engage with people who I wanted to and not be inundated with all of these advertisements and such. Do you think that was a good idea? And then kind of branching off of that, is that something that you could see other platforms adopting?
So I think there's a couple different pieces here when you say they're not going to do it. So there's a few things happening on social media like Twitter. So one is you have an algorithm that governs your newsfeed, and you've got a whole number of people that you follow, and when they share things, that then becomes a piece of information that might show up in your feed, right? And they have a set of rules called an algorithm that move those things to the top or the bottom, right? And like, there's a lot of different rules that you could think about. The more I like if I like everything you post, the things you post later might move up to the top because they know that I like your content. Or it might be that certain people that I follow have millions of followers and some only have 4 followers. And it could be that they like to uprank the people who have 1 million followers, or maybe the opposite. Maybe the people who have fewer followers, but they get to make those decisions. That's like organic content that people share. Then there's also paid content, right? So there's a whole set of information that comes up in your news feed or maybe on your sidebar that can be bought. And I think what you were alluding to there was that Twitter made a blanket ban on political ads.
Sponsored ads, right?
Right, during the certain periods of the election campaign. And, that's complicated for a couple of reasons. One is social media is a very relatively cheap way to get your message out. So there are less well-funded candidates or activist groups that now can no longer get their message out, right? So you're not only blocking the super wealthy political action campaigns, but you're also inhibiting people who maybe can't compete by paying national TV stations for ads, but maybe could afford to get their message out on social media. So that's sort of a consequence of making that blanket ban. You also have the problem of defining political content. I mean, we see everything in today's life becoming partisan, right? I mean, we see supporting the NFL being partisan.
Right.
We see, and you've done lots of work in that area. We see wearing a mask in a pandemic becoming a very partisan activity. Right. Now, when Twitter says we're going to ban political content, does that mean the NFL can't, send out an ad or not? And it just becomes really hard to define what is a political message. And so now those companies are having to make that call.
Yeah. Do you think, I would love to have, to hear from Jack on this, and just to kind of see what, after having done it, will he do it again? Will he do it again? But I guess in that same thread, because you mentioned it there, talking about political polarization, that was always a concept. A lot of your classes, political communication, that course in particular, we talked about some ideas related to selective attention, selective exposure.
Sure.
That's always been some concepts that have interested me. What's the latest on that? I mean, have you looked at some things as it relates to 2020 or?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I have 2020 data being collected out in the field. I'm working with I'm trying to remember what it used to be called, the Cooperative Congressional Election Studies, but I think they dropped congressional from it. So now it's just the Cooperative Election Studies out of Harvard.
And that's that same data set that you had gotten from 2016.
No, I independently collected data in 2016. So this was a different, but it's similar. We're working with a national sample. By pooling a bunch of research teams together, the idea for this study is that you can actually get representative data down to the congressional district. You get over 70,000 respondents. Anyhow, I've been studying elections for a long time, doing over time data. I don't have my 2020 data yet, but my take on where the research is on selective exposure and selective attention is generally that certainly people tend to like and select content that will support their own viewpoints. There was a concern for quite some time that your students might be familiar with, that these algorithms might have rules in them that sort of trap us in an echo chamber. Because if I'm always liking views that are either on the left or the right, then the algorithm will start only giving me views from the left and the right. It becomes a feedback loop.
Right.
You could call that a filter bubble or an echo chamber, depending on how you want to conceptualize it. But that idea has largely not empirically been borne out in lots of different contexts. It turns out that our media environment, our traditional media environment, has become so partisan. So you think of Fox News on the right or MSNBC on the left, that if I turn on the TV and I watch the traditional media, it's likely to be pretty partisan and biased. Whereas if I go on Facebook, even if I'm most likely seeing more on the right or more on the left, depending on who I am, I'm still likely to have, like, a cousin that I totally disagree with, but we still connect because we're family, or a friend who we share the same love of a sports team and we like each other's content, except when it gets political. So it turns out that that idea that we are walled off from opposing viewpoints online doesn't really hold water. In fact, quite the opposite, that the more people go online, the more they see opposite viewpoints. That doesn't mean you're persuaded to believe the opposite viewpoint. It might even repel you and make you mad. But it's certainly a different experience than when you turn on your favorite news channel, where you're very unlikely to get opposing viewpoints. But the way the left and the right have constructed their media environments is not the same. And I think we see that all the way at the level of our political leaders, right? So in this election in 2020, we had Donald Trump on the right, and Donald Trump is he's a president who was very, very blunt about serving his party's viewpoints. And he's not a president who's very often reaching out to the left. In fact, he's way more often going to be demonizing Democrats.
Right.
And on the left, with a candidate like Joe Biden, who was a more moderate candidate from their primary pool, you look at his rhetoric from his speech just the other night when he claimed victory in the election. It was a very conciliatory, I'm going to be the president for everyone type speech. And I think you see that mirrored in the partisan media ecosystems. So I think if you turn on any of these channels that are very aligned with Trump, they are very apt to be sharing information that isn't vetted. They're more likely to be demonizing the other side and not give the other side much light, those viewpoints. If you look on the left, I think you see more of it's still biased, and I'm not saying that, but on the left, you see a media ecosystem that is more likely to still have an editorial from a probably moderate, but a conservative. You're going to see reporting that is more fact-based and adhering to norms. So I think what we're seeing is our entire media ecosystems are sort of reflecting what our candidates' rhetoric is like. But then, of course, those media ecosystems feed on which candidates we choose. So it's sort of a reciprocal process. I think that's an interesting thing, and I don't think social media is at the core of that.
Interesting. Yeah, I think undoubtedly Trump has made us more polarized, and it's funny when we look at cable news too. And this is the one that's always resonated with me and stays with me. I forget what year it was. I think it was 2014, 2015, Pew Research. I think we actually read it in your class. It was something to the effect of both Fox and MSNBC are both notoriously over 70% opinion. Like when I read that and try to comprehend that and make sense of that, I'm like, we can't even call that news.
Right.
We shouldn't even call that news. We should just call it political banter on the left and political banter on the right.
Sure.
But so many people watch, one or the other, and they just take that as if it's the holy grail, and that is it. You can't have a conversation with them. It's the end all be all.
But I think going back to our conversation about the business models on the internet, it has a big thing. It speaks a lot to that, because doing original news gathering is expensive. It's hard to do journalism. I mean, it takes a lot of resources. And when the internet tacked toward this business model of giving away stuff for free and then selling the data, that put the journalism industry in a very tough bind. And a lot of online newspapers tried to go that way, to give away their news for free and then sell the data, but they just didn't have the reach that these other companies did to be able to monetize. And the journalism industry went into nosedive in terms of its revenues and profits. And when we think about what is cheaper to do, to sit around and editorialize about the news and spout and have talking heads, versus going out on the ground and doing the news reporting and sending people to bureaus all over the world to observe what's happening in the world, it's pretty clear what's more expensive. And so I think that the internet does have something to do with that business model of news thriving. And what we see now, especially in the wake of Trump, is more people have started to pay for news, but they're not paying for their local newspaper as much as they're paying for, a more left-wing New York Times or Washington Post,
right,
or a more right-wing Wall Street Journal.
Yep.
And you're seeing these national news organizations get a lot of resources, but you're not seeing the local news organizations get the resources. And typically, our local news organizations are the ones that are less polarized.
Right.
And so now it's harder to find any media that is, trying to be more centrist. Like a lot of local news, when we're talking about what the score of the local high school football game is, or which road is being paved, that has historically been a less partisan thing, though I would argue that even today we're seeing small towns become more and more partisan, because the parties are sort of inheriting, even at the local level, the same sort of rhetoric we're seeing at the federal level. And we're seeing people even sort, people who, these purple states are, even here in Ohio, it's sort of tacking in one direction. You're seeing a lot of people who feel like they are a minority view in their own community, leaving for a community that they feel like has their own political beliefs more. And that's troubling, in my view, for our country.
Yeah, that is. I mean, because then you're really not exposing yourself to anybody that's different from you. I mean, you're just, adding on to what's already going on social media and on cable news. And of course, if we can have those conversations face to face, even if you don't agree with somebody, just hearing something different, I mean, it has to be beneficial on some level. But I guess I would ask a follow-up, going back to these echo chambers. Do you think there's a different way that we could study this or look at this that hasn't been looked at before? Are there new ways of understanding this idea that maybe when you and I, we're together more that we didn't discuss or hadn't yet thought of?
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much interesting work happening. I can highlight a couple of them. I mean, one is researchers have been a little slow to get our skills up to speed with the level of really sophisticated computational data collection that these tech companies do, that they made all their money on. But we're catching up. And computational research methods to be able to track what people are doing online and do more sophisticated and more accurate analysis of what people are exposed to and where they are in time and space. There's a lot of exciting work happening that's using new methods, computational methods, much larger data sets, to be able to ask more nuanced questions and more sophisticated questions. I also think that this idea of a filter bubble or an echo chamber across our entire population is one that I think is relatively settled at this point in the academic circles, though I don't think we've done a great job communicating this out to the world at large. But like I said, I think that actually when you're using communication technology like social media, you're more likely to be exposed to the other side, not likely to be walled off. I think that's settled, but I think there are new areas. Rather than looking at a population at large, we need to do work that looks at specific communities. And when we see, large closed Facebook groups or WhatsApp groups or Telegram groups, really radicalizing, doing activism on the left and the right. And also, you can't even say left or right, but completely conspiratorial stuff. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in those areas. And I think that one thing that the internet does do, since we don't have as much gatekeeping on it, as we do in the traditional media, is we do have this idea of conspiracy or misinformation or sort of just wild speculation happening online in a way that's new to social media. And we need to study how that happens. And I think that what we're seeing is, and I like to think about Trump, right? And with Trump, we all know where he starts to get his message out, right? What social media platform he prefers.
Right. Twitter.
Right? It's Twitter. And so you look at the Twitter user, and it's only 10% of people or so that are using Twitter. And of those 10%, most of them aren't Trump's base. So a very small number of Trump's base are actually on Twitter watching him tweet. But instead, they're getting his message amplified by other media, right? They might talk to their friends. They might watch Fox News. They might log into Breitbart, whatever it is.
Right.
But it's interesting.
Screenshot on Facebook or whatever.
Yes. Yeah, totally. So, I think it's interesting to think about how the vast majority of people don't even care about news and politics, and in fact are put off by it. Yet everybody hears about Trump's tweets, whether you want to or not because you're following him on Twitter. And to understand how the social media sort of misinformation conspiracy space is able to amplify fringe messages and get those fringe messages pushed out into mainstream public dialogue, that's an interesting area of study. And there are certainly people doing it, but I think that's an area where more and more research will happen.
So I think a perfect segue then from there would be this idea of media literacy, right? If this is the world we're living in, if this is how we're getting our information, if this is how we're communicating with others and making sense of the world, where does media literacy tie in here with not only our youth, but also everyone across the population?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we think about what we can do to have a more functional society, I mean, I think I'd like to think that most people could agree right now that there are big problems with our form of self-governance. We have a lot of gridlock happening at the federal level. If a single party doesn't control both houses of Congress and the presidency, not much is getting done. And we saw that during the Obama administration. We saw that during the Trump administration. And that's not a great functional government. And we see that sort of in this affective polarization where more and more people aren't liking each other because of their political party. So when we think about the remedy for this, I think one remedy is education, that the more people are informed, democracy depends on people being informed. And when we have a fragmented information environment, which we do, we need people to be discerning about the information that they see. And absolutely, one remedy could be that we could reform our educational system that media literacy gets taught middle schools and high schools more so. It's more emphasized as a subject. There was a time when math and science and English weren't widely, taught in the way that they are today. And there's a reason that those have helped our society progress. And I would argue, and I think you're making the argument too, that if we included media literacy or more of the communication technology skills into all people's public education, or the educational standards that we have, that could be one way that we could sort of help the downstream gridlock and polarization and self-governance that we are having problems with.
So you mentioned something, and this might sound a little outlandish, but I know I could say it and have a conversation about it, because I think I might even have mentioned it before. And I think I still hold this belief even more so today. I tend to believe that our two-party system isn't working, and we need to do something different. I don't have all the answers or the solutions, but I just know from the little history I know that people worked more together. And not in the, not way back. I mean, just go back to Bill Clinton. I mean, he had very favorable ratings on both sides, right? And that's in my lifetime. Do you think I'm crazy, or do you think there's a place for at least that conversation, to where, I mean, first off, for starters, maybe just have Joe Jorgensen the opportunity to debate.
I mean, I think this is a conversation worth having and engaging in. I do think we have the tendency to look to the past with rose-tinted glasses. We had a lot of gridlock with Clinton. He was impeached. He certainly had his ethical lapses. And there are big problems with some of the ways government was functioning back in the 90s. And then, of course, that culminated in a very highly contentious election between Bush and Gore. You go back further, you see the Vietnam War and the way that tore our country apart, and you see President Nixon, who resigned. And you go back further, we're a country that had a civil war. I mean, we're not there in polarization. I mean, we're not at war with each other. Hopefully we don't go there again. So I always caution the discussion to, it used to be so great. I mean, we've always had problems. And I could agree with you on the fundamental point that part of those problems might be that we're entrenched in a two-party system. However, we do see multi-party systems thriving in other government systems, like parliamentary systems over in Europe. And
Norway has an unbelievable system set up.
Right. So there's lots of systems, but we are seeing a global rise of sort of populist authoritarianism in multi-party systems and our own two-party system. And I think there's a lot of things we could talk about that have to do with it. I'm not sure the two-party system is the primary culprit, though certainly having more voices at the table, having more people in the debate with viewpoints outside of the two-sided might help our public deliberation. But I mean, I would argue things like our rampant financial inequalities across the world are bigger global issues that we have to sort out that might be driving some of our political dysfunction across the world. And, if you track inequality across humankind, it's always been bad. But periods of rapid inequality growth often are related to periods of high violence. And so I don't know. I mean, I guess, sure, I think it would be great to have more viable parties or parties to be more diverse and less monolithic. but there are a lot of problems happening at once. And we have a system that's really entrenched and there's a lot of money in it. So even on the political side, with some rulings that have happened on the Supreme Court that have allowed essentially unlimited money from corporate entities to go toward campaigns, the people who get elected play that game. And to play that game, you have to participate in the system. It seems very difficult to imagine somebody able to, from within that system, get enough power to be able to then break apart that system. But that's almost what needs to happen.
Right. And I think it should. I think if we got back to people, running for the people, truly running for the people. I mean, I think, everybody says that, right? It's kind of like lip service, but do they really mean it? I mean, and I don't care either side. I mean, I'm pretty bipartisan. I think a lot of that is lip service. And I think if we got rid of the money in politics, if we got rid of lobbyists, or at least downsized it, you would see more genuine people who really genuinely want to help. I think.
I mean, I'm all for getting there.
But you're right. Getting to that point where we can, pluck somebody out of the system and say, hey, do you have this idea too? Well, let's work together. It's hard because they're all benefiting from that system, right?
Correct. And that makes it quite difficult when we're more and more polarized in the way in which we see the solutions to these problems way different. I mean, you get two people to even agree on what are the ills that are driving our gridlock, you'll get vastly different answers. So coming up to a solution, you can't even agree on what the problem is. I'm not trying to be cynical here. I actually think that progress does happen. I think it happens slowly. I think dysfunction is persistent. I think we have really big challenges facing us as democratic people in a information flood. And I remain optimistic that we'll be able to slowly chip away at the problems. I do worry that we're chipping away so slowly and the problems are coming so quickly that it sort of continues to pile on.
Yeah, this has been really great. It's been great catching up. I guess I have one final question, and I got to end with something with some more optimism here. So, voter turnout. That's something we talked about quite a bit in class, and a lot of people voted. So, I mean, that's, I guess, one positive, right?
I completely agree. I think people have been stuck home in this pandemic largely, and many, there's some states out there like Washington State that had that everybody gets a ballot in the mail, and that's how it's always been. Well, not always, but that's how it's been done in recent history. Right. But you have a lot of states where that's not been the norm. That really absentee ballots are not happening very frequently. And so when you had a global pandemic, you have a lot more people who are preparing to vote by absentee. You also have a lot more people staying at home and reading the news, and you have a polarized environment. I think it's quite good that we had the turnout that we did. I think that's a great thing. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with our voting system, because it's a whole separate discussion, I think. But of course, We're now having debates about the validity of the system itself, which I think is fundamentally hurting our institution of democracy. But hopefully we can get to a point where we're all confident that the votes are, that our vote matters. And I think that in prior elections, a lot of people said, I'm going to vote. But then voting day came around and life was busy. But This time, you're not as busy because you're stuck at home, and you're more likely to have the ballot at home. So that created an environment for a lot of participation.
I think so. And I think you just made me think of something. Why can't we just vote on this? We do everything else here. I mean, get a QR code or a specific code, and I mean, you vote, and then you get away from the people who are saying, well, this, mail-in ballots isn't working, and there's these lost. And look, everybody did it once. Everybody got their own code, and that's it. You had to give, your social or however, you go about it.
But part of the reason our system works so well is that our voting process is so decentralized to, your local precinct level where you got the volunteers in your community who are showing up. That makes it really hard to systematically corrupt that system. I mean, if we had a single vendor who was providing the app, that would create a very big honeypot for bad actors to hack and break an election. So I think we'd have to think carefully. If we're going to go to electronic voting, we have to think really carefully about how do we do that in a way that is still decentralized, that's still secure, that is accessible to all people. It might be possible. I mean, we have seen, we've moved away from hand counting all votes. We have machines. Right. A lot of people are now voting on electronic machines with touch screens. And probably if you would go back 50 years, that would have been unimaginable to people. So, maybe we'll get there to voting on a smart device, but there's still a ways to go.
Well, again, thank you so much, Dr. Beam. This has been great. And
it's always fun to talk with you. Thank you so much.
Can't wait to share it. And until next time.
All right. Be well. Take care.
Yeah, you too.